I'm Jeremy Cosson. On today's episode, we have Dr. Daniele Piomelli, one of the world's leading researchers on neuroscience, autism, and the endocannabinoid system in cannabis. Today, Dr. Piomelli is going to discuss his research findings, what he thinks about cannabis being used as a treatment for autism, and what the future holds for research. Welcome to The Straight Dope from Canon Authority, brought to you by Leafly. I'm your host, Jeremy Cosson. Today's podcast is sponsored by Leafly. Leafly is the world's largest and most important cannabis resource on the web, with over 8 million monthly visitors and 40 million page views. It's filled with critically valuable information and reliable data on cannabis, houses some tremendous and objective research and information about cannabis, strains, information that I believe fills an educational gap that exists between patients and consumers and their physicians. So if you don't have that page bookmarked yet, set it as your homepage. I urge you to do that now. And if you like this podcast, make sure you regularly visit Leafly, www.leafly.com/news/health. You'll find all sorts of my latest articles on different health issues and stuff that we'll cover in this podcast. So for today's guest, I have none other than Dr. Daniele Piomelli. Piomelli is an Italian-born American scientist who studied neuroscience in New York City at Columbia University, studying under two of his mentors who went on to win the Nobel Prize for their contributions to medicine. Dr. Piomelli, with much of his groundbreaking research on the endocannabinoid system in the brain and nervous system, and most recently, the most important work to date on Fragile X syndrome. The work he has done is changing the way we think of autism, and his research could pave the way to, if not cure autism, radically change the way patients can manage their symptoms. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Daniele Piomelli to the show.
Our lab has been working on endocannabinoids for over 20 years. We became involved in the early 1990s when we discovered the pathways through which the endocannabinoids are produced in the brain and the rest of the body, anandamide and 2-AG. We also were involved in the discovery of the enzymes that degrade or deactivate the endocannabinoids, and were among the first to develop inhibitors for those enzymes and used those inhibitors to understand the biology of the endocannabinoid system. And I have spent, I think, the best of my last 20 years trying to understand what endocannabinoids do in the body using pharmacological as well as genetic tools, and hopefully also use that knowledge to develop new medications.
And you have like an interesting theory about cannabis and autism, and that autism's leading genetic trigger, the Fragile X syndrome, represents potentially a situation where you could correct some of the behavioral issues. Is that right, related to Fragile X syndrome?
Well, we became involved with, first of all, the role of the endocannabinoids in social behavior through one of my MD PhD students, Don Way, who is interested in psychiatry, and in particular he was interested in autism. We started looking at the potential role for endocannabinoids in normal social behavior, and made some interesting discoveries. Found that this one endocannabinoid called anandamide is very important in regulating what we technically call a social reward, which means the pleasure that animals experience by being in the company of their peers. So that particular pleasure, which we call social reward, is the drive behind social behavior, because obviously animals are social insofar as they enjoy being social. And the discovery that the endocannabinoid system was involved, and particularly anandamide was involved in social behavior, is interesting from a basic science perspective, but we also were able to test the hypothesis that it might also be important from a therapeutic perspective in disorders of the brain, such as autism, in which social behavior is dysfunctional. And we used animal models for that, animal models, mouse models of social dysfunction. There are several such models. We used two of them. And one of these models is the one that captures one particular form of autism spectrum disorder called the Fragile X syndrome. The Fragile X syndrome is a complex syndrome, but derives from a single mutation in the gene for encoding for a protein called FMRP, and one can make the same mutation that is present in patients, in subjects with Fragile X in animals. And in those animals, one can study behavior. These animals behave strangely, if I may use this word. They behave abnormally for a mouse. And what we could do is by using agents that interfere with the destruction of the endocannabinoid and anandamide, we were able to show that these agents normalized behavior in animals with the mutation, the Fragile X mutation. So, in a nutshell, endocannabinoids appear not only to be important in regulating normal social behavior, but also to be possibly involved in the dysfunctional behavior that accompanies at least certain forms of autism spectrum disorders. So, the endocannabinoids offer hope that one could, by interfering particularly with their destruction, so by boosting their activity, one might normalize social behavior in children with autism.
Interesting. And so, I mean, in your research, because I know, also some criticism that people have is that in terms of a lot of sort of therapeutic potential for cannabis, a lot of it's anecdotal, other things are, sort of treated like herbalism rather than really sort of isolating, these different active components that would potentially help people. So
yeah, that's a very good question. That is a very good question. I think there is a lot of confusion out there. So one reason why we became interested in the endocannabinoid role in social behavior is because for years people have used marijuana as a social drug to facilitate social behavior in a sense. In the 70s, when marijuana was, of course, very, very popular in the hip generation, the use of marijuana was used essentially to be together, sort of a social facilitator. The problem is there are many different types of marijuana. There is, the marijuana back in the 70s had only about 3% of the active ingredient, tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, and very little of this other component called cannabidiol, CBD. Now, the marijuana that one finds in the market, both legal and illegal, is extremely high in THC. We're talking about well above 10%, in many cases closer to 20%. And these are very important things because pharmacology is all about doses. The same thing at low doses can be good, at high doses can be bad. So one thing one needs to understand is that if the endocannabinoid system has a protective role, it doesn't mean that activating the system with a drug from outside will be protective too. It can actually be harmful. And in fact, it can be harmful, for example, because by overactivating the cannabinoid, the endogenous cannabinoid system, it can turn it off. It can cause changes that are persistent and are detrimental to the organism because of the existence of this endocannabinoid system that is necessarily sensitive to the environment in which a person lives. So by using cannabis, one risks to really mess up the endocannabinoid system. And so even though the intent is to enhance social behavior, one may end up actually having the opposite effect.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, the dosage is just so critical, and a lot of the research I've seen, even when it comes to like neuropathic pain, if at a certain point, like a moderate, may be effective, and then once you get it past a certain point, it could actually create more pain, right? And so the endocannabinoid system, there's a point where it's helpful, and then a point where it's destructive.
Exactly. I think dose is really extremely important. It's a concept, though, that is somehow, it's kind of a gray area, and the public likes to see black and white, but that's not right. It is a gray area, and one must live with that gray. It is very, very important to understand that low doses of cannabis can be useful in certain things, But if you check up the doses, you not very quickly will come up with a substantial number of side effects that will completely obliterate, completely offset the positive effects of marijuana. So that is something that I think the public needs to be aware of. You see, we're familiar with marijuana because it's been around for so many years, and very few people are scared of it. In fact, the idea that marijuana is risky, is decreasing, if anything. But it's not decreasing based on science. It's not decreasing based on real knowledge. It's decreasing because we are getting used to it. And that is not right. I mean, we should, one needs to live with a risk, understand a risk based on data, not based on the fact that, oh, well, I've seen it so many times. It's not going to hurt. It will hurt. It will hurt if you take too much of it, if you take it for too long, if you take it when you're an adolescent, if you take it maybe when you are under stress. There will be conditions in which marijuana will be harmful. And that's okay. We can live with it as a society as long as we understand what the risks are. Right now, we don't.
And we're so feeling driven over, logic driven and data driven. It's, sort of, I think a lot of the, sort of the debate that's fueled a lot of changes, which, good changes, but a lot of it is sort of the anecdotal stories that, the politicians look at and they go, sort of pulls your heartstrings. But then we kind of forget about really analyzing the science and ensuring that, it's not this complete Wild West and people know what they're doing, because there's so many variances in terms of, THC levels in different strains and all these different things.
No, there is an added complexity, but, we're dealing with the plant, and plants are always complex, When you think, for example, at opium and morphine comes, of course, from papaver somniferum opium. And, opium also contains a whole bunch of different things. And for some people it works, and for other people it doesn't work. And morphine very reliably does what it's supposed to be doing, and that's that we understand morphine much more deeply than we do opium. I don't think, quite frankly, that we understand cannabis very well at all. A lot of statements that you find on the web, I would say the vast majority of them are based on assumptions and anecdotes, sometimes on logic. But data trump logic anytime, because it may be logical to think that a plant is better than a synthetic drug. Some people believe things like this, it kind of makes sense. But the fact is, it's not true. It's simply not true, because a plant is made of chemicals, and a lot of those chemicals are those that the growers put on the plant. So it will depend on many things. The fertilizers, the pesticides, the way the plant is grown, and all these things are variables that the consumer has no control on, and obviously they can be risky. Think about, for example, bacteria. Have you ever thought about this? But cannabis is a living thing, and when you dry it, there's a lot of living material in there, material in which carbohydrates and protein and lipids on which bacteria can live. So you can have, depending on the storage of marijuana, you can have different bacterial loads, and this bacteria can have effects, especially if you, instead of smoking it, you eat it, for example. And these are all variables that people don't necessarily have to know, but then once you know them, you realize that they can be substantially problematic.
Right. There's so many different variables, as you said, different levels of THC, different levels of CBD, how it's grown, pesticides, maybe lack of, control in terms of how it was cultivated and all these different things. And I know there's, a lot of parents that have, that are raising autistic children, they're sort of willing to, they come to a point that they're willing to try almost anything. And I've spoken to some of them, and some of them have had, some amazing success, but it was a lot of trial and error. And it was trial and error in terms of dosage, trial and error in terms of strains and everything. And There's one woman I spoke to, and I think it's like 15 different strains, I think, and then it provided amazing relief. But, I just wonder, how do you feel about, parents out there that are considering it for their children because they've just kind of given up hope on other things and all the different side effects of other drugs that have been given to their kids. Obviously there's a lot of risks involved as well. And there's not a lot of really credible, good information out there.
No, there isn't. And that's terrible. How do I feel about those parents? I feel completely sympathetic with them. I feel for them and for their situation. But the fact is that we have no proof that cannabis, any type of cannabis, really works for autistic children. There are anecdotes, and anecdotes should not be dismissed. An anecdote is not something that, we don't pay attention to it. It's just an anecdote. No, an anecdote it's a pointer. It's something that suggests something that needs then to be either proven or disproven. But it's an anecdote. So it's no data. It's not data. Data are something that you get when you do a study on a large number of subjects and is well controlled, so that you eliminate a lot of psychological confounders that unfortunately are very much at play when you are the parent of an autistic child and you deeply love this child and you want him or her to be better. And so you're trying anything, and you're getting a result, or you're thinking you're getting a result. So these are situations that are really ripe with psychological confounders, and because of this reason, in total good faith, a parent can mislead other parents, and who will try. And hope, and some of them might be able to get positive result, but the majority of them won't. And the risk is that they will actually worsen the condition of their children, because we have really no accurate information on how in children cannabis affects behavior, affects physiology. We have very, very limited information on that because it's very, very new. Cannabis is something that was traditionally used, it's been traditionally used from the mid-adolescent years on, not in children who are 7, 8, or 10, in an age when the brain is in full development, and cannabinoid receptors, the receptors for THC in cannabis, are expressed by neural cells in the brain and do all sort of important things in brain development. And, with all the best of intentions, these parents give this drug to their kids, some of them convincing themselves that they're seeing something, but what are the consequences? Are they even making the situation worse? These are very important thoughts that have to go through the mind of parents as they make this crucial decision as to whether they want to use their kids as a testing ground for an unproven drug.
Definitely not as a first line. The parents I've spoken to, it was kind of like a sort of last line of defense.
Yeah.
Do you think in any of those circumstances, it's appropriate to consider, or is it just there's just so little data out there that it's just too risky?
I think it's too risky. I think it's really, really too risky. I am not. I don't judge. I don't judge people, and I most certainly would not pass judgment on a parent who is desperate and would do it. I'm just saying, be very, very careful of what you do. So let me turn around your question. I'm going to answer it my own way. I'm going to tell you, I recently told my mom, who is 87, I said, Mom, she suffers from pain and nothing works for her. And I asked her to try cannabis. And I did so lightheartedly. That is, I was not feeling, I thought about it seriously. I said, would it work? Would it have side effects? In a person, 87, it's an old age. I figured I feel comfortable that I can have my mother use marijuana for relief of her pain, for the relief of her pain. She didn't, but I suggested it to her. Would I do the same to my daughter if my daughter had any ailment? Well, I don't know, because I'm not in that position, but I don't think I would. Because the data that I am familiar with are data from animals. They're not data from people. But the data that I'm familiar with tell us very clearly that if you give cannabis for a long period of time to animals in a young age, these animals will be persistent, that their brains will be in subtle but important ways modified later on in life. And that is something that I will not make the decision for my daughter. I can't. I don't have that kind of I don't have that kind of power. But as I said, I don't judge. So I don't judge people, especially I don't judge people who are suffering. And here is another situation where I would have no doubt whatsoever of prescribing, quote unquote, marijuana. If you are, say, an HIV patient suffering from a neuropathic pain, there are tons of data out there suggesting that marijuana works. I would say yes, go ahead and do that. If you are, say, if you have nausea because of anti-cancer medications and you've tested marijuana and it works for you, again, I would say not a problem. It would be crazy not to use it. But these are all situations where we have data.
Right, especially
with autism, we don't. And how can one make an intelligent decision without information? And what can we get lucky? Yes, we can get lucky.
Mm-hmm.
But what if we're not lucky?
I wonder, how do you get the data? Because obviously, you can do all these different preclinical trials and everything like that, but how would you actually do clinical research on human subjects, given the fact that, we're talking about children?
Well, there are clinical trials on children. Fragile X, for example, there are drugs that are given to, test drugs that are given to children in Fragile X, and some of them work and most of them don't work. There are recent data, one drug, for example, that has given some hope to work in young patients. There is such a thing as clinical trial for children. Obviously, it has to be done in a very careful, very well-controlled manner so that the child doesn't run the risk of toxicity and short-term or long-term toxicity. And certain risks are impossible to avoid. But if the condition is serious enough, people, will take them. As I said, Fragile X is so serious that a lot of people accept that. But even depression, for example, which is very common in children, there are clinical trials in children of antidepressant drugs, and children will be volunteered, so to speak, to do these trials because there is because they really the parents want them to feel better. And, as long as it's well controlled, and as long as it's, done in a sufficient number of patients so that the results have some power that can tell us something, then it's a risk that is worth taking. Where is not worth taking is where you are just betting on an idea because you read it on the internet. I don't know about you, but I don't trust what I read on the internet.
Right. No, I know. Just like cancer, for example. If you do a search that it pops up all these things like 30 studies prove cannabis cures cancer, and they cite all these studies from researchers I've spoken to who said, no, that's absolutely totally misrepresenting my my research. And it's just if you get, and these types of sites pop up constantly. They're like the highest.
Oh yeah.
And so they're just
yeah. And the other thing that I think everybody should be aware of is that this is not a mom and pop's operation anymore. It's not that we got some. We have this wonderful plant that, grows in the Garden of Eden, and there are some evil drug manufacturers who are trying to, peddle drugs to us, and they're hiding, this beautiful plant. This is BS. This is total BS. I'm not trying to defend the drug manufacturers for crying out loud. That's the last thing I want to do. But here's the thing. There is a huge business behind marijuana. And, we should be aware of that. And people who are going to make money, they're not going to be very sensitive and careful. And most people, especially if there are no regulations, and there are no regulations, most people would just go ahead and say whatever suits their agenda. Maybe finding, smart words, maybe, using a little word mongering. But the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of people out there who are selling marijuana, and they're saying that he does stuff that he doesn't do, and they're saying those things to sell it. It's pretty as simple as that. They make hemp oil with very low levels of THC. And what is the very low levels of THC with high levels of CBD is 3% THC. 3% THC is a lot of THC. 3% THC is enough to make you high. I mean, if it's enough to make you high, it's enough to cause trouble, let me tell you. So you can find all sort of BS out there. It's really quite preposterous.
Well, I mean, some of it's maybe various or self-motivated, and then others, it's confirmation bias. People see what they want to see, and so they're not being rational or objective in terms of the information that they're presenting.
Exactly. And the fact that all is tinged by politics makes things even worse, because then other people start second-guessing motives behind other people. So, I mean, if I say you should be careful, if you are the father or mother of an autistic child, to use marijuana, the first thing people say, maybe he's, in the other camp, in the anti-marijuana camp. I am in no camp. I am in the camp of data. I want to see data. If you show me data, I'm convinced. If you tell me your opinion, no matter how smart it is and how logical it is, I'll say, well, thank you. That's appreciated, but show me the money. Show me the data. And as I said, in autism, very, very little data. But, it should not be seen as a negative thing. It's a positive thing in a sense. We are in the business of making discoveries here. We are trying to move forward the needle of medicine. And to move forward the needle of medicine, we have to, first of all, recognize what we don't know. And what we don't know right now is the impact of marijuana on autism. But we are starting to learn about the endocannabinoid system in the brain and how it regulates social behavior. Not just our work, the work of many other researchers. We are starting to learn how changing this system can improve social behavior. We're starting to learn how in pathological conditions where this system is dysfunctional, there is also dysfunction in behavior and how this can be fixed. All these are things that I think point in the right direction and should motivate us to do those studies that now are missing, not to fake that we have a knowledge we don't have. Recognize our ignorance as a temporary status. We are temporarily ignorant, but we can fill this knowledge gap. We want to.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Well, I mean, I just wonder, in terms of, obviously, like a lot of parents that are dealing with it, the research can't come soon enough, and it's tons and tons of challenges and hurdles to do the research that needs to be done.
And patients want answers.
Right.
I know. But that's the situation. That's the situation, Jeremy. There is no shortcut. There is no shortcut. If an individual wants to take a shortcut, I'm okay with it. As I said, I pass no judgment. Sure. But then that person should know that it's her or his personal responsibility, because we just don't know. And, I get these emails all the time from people. I want to try CBD. What do you recommend? I recommend not. Well, how can I seriously recommend something when there are no data to even further, even suggest that this something could be useful? We just need that kind of work. It's as simple as that. I'll tell you, it is very, very dangerous not to do that, because then it's enough that somebody gets hurt. And if somebody gets hurt, and doesn't have to be because of marijuana or because of cannabis or because of THC or CBD, it could be for anything. let's say that somebody gets hurt because it's a particular batch of marijuana grown by a particular grower contains E. coli. I'm just making this stuff up, right? And, a bunch of people get hurt because of that. What do you think what will be the effect on the entire cannabis therapeutic field? It will be devastating.
Right.
It would be devastating. And so, because when things are not done right, my dear Jeremy, shit happens. This is the technical term. Shit happens. And we don't want that. We do not want that.
No,
because, but that's why I think those people who most believe in marijuana should be the most careful.
Right.
Should be the most careful. I am one of them because I have devoted my life to the study of this particular plant, of its ingredients and how it affects the body, how it affects the brain. I care about this. I don't want it to be spoiled by some accident that will inevitably happen if people are not careful with it.
No, and I agree 100% with you, and that's why I think it's so important to factually and accurately represent things rather than make these exaggerated claims, because it can be extremely counterproductive. If something really a catastrophe potentially happened, it sets everything back.
Yeah, well, you can edit out the S word, but I wanted to put it in I wanted to tell you that because it is very, very close to my heart, because this kind of stuff happens all the time. Mm-hmm. It does happen all the time. And it would be such a shame, because our society, swings like a pendulum, and right now is swinging in one direction. But, eventually will swing in the other. But I think we need to take advantage. There are good things in marijuana. There are many good things in marijuana. We just cannot afford to waste them because we are not careful and we are not cautious and we're not doing this the right way.
And you're so right. They seem to have a difficult time finding a middle ground. It's always the pendulum shifts to extremes.
Yeah.
So we overreact either way. Now I know you have to go, but just in closing, let's just say everything is in alignment, and the DEA does reclassify cannabis as off of Schedule 1, and it becomes easier to conduct a lot of research. Your research thus far has been very promising. This is purely speculative, but how do you see us progressing in the next couple of years in terms of research? What do you see as the outlook of the future for this type of research?
Having the courage of recognizing what we don't know, having the courage of filling knowledge gaps that we need to fill without fear of repercussions, without fear of the unknown, but at the same time, with all the caution and all the leveraging all the knowledge that we currently have. And this is true for every single indication which cannabis and cannabinoid-based medicines could be applied, and it's certainly true for autism and autism spectrum disorders.
I really appreciate all your insights. Learned a lot from you, so thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Jeremy. Take care now. Bye-bye.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye. Now, also, if you have ideas for future episodes, people you would like me to interview, or maybe you have a story to share with us, or you just want to say hi, visit cannaauthority.us and sign up for Canna Authority's free spam-free newsletter. And again, visit cannaauthority.us. You can check out our services as well. We provide authority marketing packages and content marketing for innovative businesses and high-integrity professionals in the industry.